I'm Alex Bauman. I work in data sciences platform, so I work within the same group that creates Terra. I'm a solutions architect there, so I work on with a lot of people on external-facing projects, a lot of integrations within here. Before that, I was product owner for FireCloud, if people are familiar with FireCloud, our previous user interface before we had Terra. So we're going to go through talking about billing and access control within Terra. So Terra itself runs on Google Cloud Platform. We have plans later for other types of clouds, but at the moment it's tied to Google Cloud. All of the costs for storage and compute, data egress, so that's costs of actually pulling data out of the cloud, they're all billed to Google billing accounts. So Google billing accounts basically say, where do you charge money to for the compute and storage that you do within projects in Google. Terra connects those Google billing accounts to a Terra billing project itself, which is under the hood, it's a Google project that Terra manages. The projects are where all of those individual pieces of compute and storage actually live. So they're kind of sandboxed to those projects. You need a billing account in order to clone these workspaces. So the cloning of workspaces, there's nothing that actually incurs any kind of cost, but if you would like to run compute, if you would like to do storage, we need to know what billing account to bill that to. So basically it's a prerequisite before you can clone, and in order to do a clone or create a new workspace, that's what you would need in order to do any kind of analysis, to actually run any pipelines, do anything, use notebooks. So there's multiple ways you can gain access to Terra billing projects. So one of the ways is by somebody else's billing projects. So for example, the owner of an existing billing project can add you to their billing project. That means you can do things like create workspaces within there. Similarly, they can also give you access to workspaces that they are on, but you won't have the ability to create new ones. You're just on a workspace. So we have these kind of separate tiers of access levels. You can set up a Google billing account and link it to a new billing project. So some people may already have Google billing accounts. Some people can create new billing accounts. We'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. But those can actually be tied to your billing project so that we actually know who to bill these things to. We also have within our platform free credits that are available. Free credits, what they do in the background is they actually create a billing account for you that you can, and a project that you can then create workspaces in. And so if you're trying to set up a Google billing account, there's a few different ways. So the standard way that Google provides is using a credit card. So some people will use that, but a lot of institutions can't because they don't use credit cards. So they use a different kind of system. People that are at the BroadE, for example, are able to do this because we have a system of cost objects. Each cost object is tied to a Google billing account. This makes it very easy. So if you have a grant that's tied to some cost object, you're able to just bring that billing account into Terra and start creating projects and creating workspaces and running analyses. So that's the easiest transition within an institution like ourselves. Other institutions tend to do the third bullet point, which is actually creating a Google billing account through a third-party reseller, such as Onyx. Basically what this is that Onyx agrees to pay Google, and you agree to pay Onyx, so they're taking on the liability of people getting payments and things like that, because Google only really wants to have credit cards. So Google's not in the business of actually doing this with institutions. There's companies like Onyx that do it with institutions. And a lot of institutions make use of things like Onyx and Smartronix and Carasoft, a lot of these companies that are also used by government agencies as well. So they're used to working with like large-scale institutions. And our free crediting works through Onyx, and they're actually the ones that they get money to, from the NCI to handle these free credits that we have in, and they negotiate with there, and then they provide them to our users to make this very easy for people to get up and running. The free credits on Terra, they begin once you click on the Start Trial button. So this is something that shows up for users that are new coming into Terra. They're able to sign up for these free credits. You have $300 of credits for use for any of the things I mentioned before, whether it's egress or compute or storage. It can be used for any of those. That amount of money, how much it can provide really depends upon the kind of analysis that you're doing. There's a lot of analyses that are very low cost. There's some things that cost a lot more. The credits right now are available for 60 days or until you've used up the $300 available. And so what happens is that the reseller that we have notifies people who sign up for the free credits when they reach 50% mark, 75% mark, 90% mark, and try to have you sign up for, like if you'd like to continue using this and change into using a reseller where you can institutionally continue to use the project that you've set up and the workspaces you've created, they'll reach out to you to offer an ability to set up an agreement with them where basically you start paying them after your trial expires. If you can set up an agreement like that, it's a very easy transition. If you are from the BroadE and you have existing cost objects, you're able to change over billing projects to go to a different cost object, which is a Google billing account, at any time. So it's easy to actually move things across different grants, for example. If you have a grant that expires and you have a new grant that comes in that would pay for the data storage for a previous grant, for example, you're able to do that within the Terra platform by changing billing accounts. In terms of cost management, so this is one of the topics we hear about regularly from people trying to estimate how much will it cost to do an analysis. It's actually very difficult to know this without kind of running it first and understanding how much it would cost to do it on a small number of samples and then scale it up to a larger number of samples. We provide some controls within our platform that hopefully make this easier for people to figure out what it's going to cost. So for notebooks are basically, you have a series of machines where you're going to run your computations within Jupyter, you're running R code, you might be using something like Hail. All of these run on machines that run as long as you have your notebook open. And we provide a cost estimate for how much does this machine or set of machines cost per hour. And so from that, if you know that this script that you're trying to run runs for 4 hours, you can calculate how much is this analysis going to cost, for example. A lot of times people are also using smaller size notebooks to run kind of ad hoc analyses. And so you can get a sense of, if I have this notebook up and running during the day and I'm doing work, how much would it cost me on a daily basis, for example. We also automatically pause notebooks when you're not using them in order to have the cost lower so that you're not just leaving a machine up and running over the weekend, for example, or overnight when you're not using it. You can also, when you're looking at a lot of our featured workspaces that have a lot of the best practice pipelines, for example, the GATK workflows, other types of tools that you're using, we always put in cost estimates within there. The cost estimates are usually broken down by how much does it cost for a whole genome and how much does it cost for like a targeted region, for example. And you can use that to try to understand what the approximate cost would be for a whole genome or for an exome, and then figure out for the number of samples, for example, you're trying to process, how much would this overall processing cost. Additionally, we have the ability to track costs inside of a workspace for workflows that have already been run. At the moment, this is tied to working with BroadE billing accounts only, but we're doing work right now to make this work across the board. But basically, this will tell you if you've run a workflow, how long did it take for this workflow to run? How much did it cost? Then you can look at things about understanding, if you run it for one sample, how much would it cost for n number of samples, for example? Or if you did it for a very small, like for an exome, how much would it cost approximately for a genome if that scaling is approximately linear? The other big piece of this is around access control within Terra. So we've tried to keep things as hierarchical as possible so that you can have different things, have different access controls. This is very similar to what you'll find natively in things like Google Cloud Platform. It also allows people to essentially be managers of different resources. So you might have a lab where they decide that there are certain people in the lab that give people access to resources so that they can track costs rather than let everybody create anything that they want and then not be able to necessarily know who has access to what, how much money is being spent. So people can actually have different roles within our platform that tie to the kinds of resources they're trying to manage. So we have permissions in Terra around users, around the resources themselves, like the billing projects, the workspaces, the various groups of users. And then we also have different kinds of policies that determine, essentially like what kinds of actions can people take within our platform, especially within workspaces, for example. Examples of these different types of policies and roles. So we have owners, for example, like owners of a workspace. So somebody who owns a workspace can delete a workspace. They can decide who has access to the workspace. They can designate other owners. So this is kind of the highest level access that somebody would have to a resource like a workspace. You can also give somebody write access to the workspace. So that means you can modify the workspace, you can run analyses, but you can't do things like delete it. You can't necessarily do things like share it with other people. So it's more for people that are kind of running the analysis itself. Somebody who is a reader can just see the results within a workspace. So for example, you have some results that you've run an analysis in a workspace, you'd like to share it with collaborators, but there's no reason for them to rerun anything or change your results. You can share it with them read-only. This is also the access level that we use in Terra to give people access to our featured workspaces, for example. Those are all read-only, and people are able to clone and then run their own analysis from it. And that's a very common pattern that you'll see among people that have read-only access, is they can make a copy and now become an owner of their own copy and start going downstream from there. We also have these different kinds of policies associated, so separate than the kind of roles, we have things like can compute. So within Workspaces itself, this will determine whether you can do things like run a notebook or run a workflow, or are you just able to modify things like the description of the workspace and who has access and things like that. So you can kind of separate what kind of activities people are allowed to take within a workspace. We're trying to add a lot more of these so that it is a lot more granular, so you can really define different types of roles that are appropriate for different lab type needs. We also have the ability to grant others writer access and grant others reader access. So you might be only having a read-only copy of a workspace, but we have a policy that allows you to say, and I can also share it with other people with a read-only policy. So this means that you're able to kind of virally share it with other people, but not give them the ability to modify it. You can only give them the same level you have or lower, basically. In terms of access, so you're able to, on things like workspaces and billing projects and other resources like that, you can add individual users, but you can also create groups of users. So groups of users are very helpful, especially if you're in a setting like a lab, or you're working with a set of collaborators, you'd like to share multiple different workspaces with different people. You can create groups of those people and add those groups as permissions to the workspaces as well. So this would be similar to something you might do in Google with creating like a Google group and sharing access with a Google group. We have people who are members of the group. So these are basically, you're in the group, you can access anything the group is shared with, but you can't actually grant other members access to the group, for example. Whereas admins are able to add other users, both regular members as well as other admins. So these are people that are the people in charge of managing those kinds of groups. We additionally have this concept called authorization domains. An authorization domain is just using one of these groups of different people to add on to a workspace, and what it basically does is provide another level of security onto a workspace, which means that if I'm given access to a particular workspace and I'm authorized to it, so let's say it contains some kind of controlled data, so let's say TCGA controlled data. An authorization domain defines the set of people who are authorized to access it, and then we have the set of people that you share it with. And in order for somebody to actually access the workspace, they have to both be authorized and have it shared with them. The reason that we have this is to stop people from doing things like taking a controlled access TCGA workspace and sharing it with somebody who doesn't have controlled TCGA access, so somebody who's not on the dbGaP whitelist. This is really important because it's very easy to lose track of data permissions and consent on data and accidentally give somebody access who shouldn't have access. And with things like dbGaP, they take that very, very seriously, and a PI can lose access to the data if they share with people who are not authorized, for example. So this is a piece of technology that we try to use to kind of limit that from happening, make it harder for that to happen. And within our platform, additionally, if you do things like import TCGA data and other controlled data into your workspace, it actually carries those groups of who's authorized into your workspace. So it automatically, kind of defines who's the set of whitelisted people you could ever share with, and then other people will not be able to come into the workspace if they're not authorized. And we actually give them a message which says, oh, you're not authorized for TCGA controlled data, here's where you can apply for access, for example. So trying to protect people to do the things correctly with regards to data consent. So then for billing projects, we also have roles within there. So we have owners of billing projects. They have the full access. They can remove different users, add different users. We have a policy for workspace creator. So you can say somebody can create a workspace within my project. We have the ability for people to create notebooks within those projects and for people to be able to run workflows. So you can kind of determine different people's role levels. If you know that they're only going to use notebooks and you don't want them to accidentally run a workflow, which might be costly, you can just give them the ability to run notebooks but not workflows, for example. So we have a lot of these different kinds of granular permissions that are possible within our platform. So an example, sort of scheme of this is you might have a user who is an owner on a billing project. And you have a policy for people being able to create workspaces. In the workspaces itself, you have another user who you say, oh, they own this workspace, so they're able to kind of add new users to it, decide who's on it. And maybe there's another user who has the ability to modify that workspace. Those are the people that are kind of in charge of the content that other readers would be able to actually have access to. So you might say there's a group of collaborators who are down here, user 5 and user 6 and user 4, that are all within this, this group of collaborators, and we give them access to look at the results of our data, but there's no reason for them to be modifying it. Then you can create various different sort of complicated schemes of who's in charge of what types of levels of access and who are you collaborating with. So there's a lot of flexibility in terms of being able to define that within our system so that you don't have to just give everybody a very high level of access and then worry that somebody might delete something that you've just processed and it's cost you a large amount of money, for example. So that covers things around billing and access. Any questions about that? Yes.
Can you comment on what happens when somebody leaves the institute?
Okay, this is something that has come up very regularly. We're still trying to figure out about what the right policy is for this. So what ends up happening when somebody actually leaves the institute is that their email address is no longer, it's basically invalidated. It's no longer an email. They're still within our system and they have access to different resources, like let's say the projects they created and the workspaces they created. The most difficult part is when somebody is in the institute and they're the sole owner on a resource and they leave, it effectively becomes abandoned. Inside our own institution, we have ways to work around that because we have a certain level of trust within here because people go through the training that they need for secure data, and we know people are part of other groups, and we can kind of work with the PIs and figure it out. It's okay inside the institution. It's not ideal. Externally, we really can't do very much because it becomes a data liability issue. We can't just say, oh, sure, we'll give you access to this, and then it turns out it's data you weren't supposed to have access to. But so it becomes very, very complicated when that occurs. And what we are trying to do is figure out some sort of policy for what happens when it happens and put more controls within our software which will strongly encourage people to always assign more than one owner so that should somebody leave, there's somebody available to actually take it over.
So like you sort of discouraged me or anybody who's going to leave the institute from participating, I think is the way I interpreted your answer. So suppose there's a postdoc, does the work, moves on.
Yeah.
I heard you say they basically wouldn't be able to access their stuff anymore.
That postdoc who left. So things like that can be worked out, between the lab and the postdoc, and you can add, if somebody has a new email address when they leave the BroadE, you can add that person with that email address and give them back. It really comes down to managing policies around data access. So there's only so much we can do from a technical perspective. If you use Google Cloud, for example, you'll run into the same exact problems. And I would say it's not a discouragement for people using the platform. It's just something to keep in mind because in any kind of institution, if you leave and you had access to your email, I mean, you lose access to your email, but that doesn't discourage you from working at the institute. It's just, you need to kind of plan for what you'd like afterwards.
Did I also hear you say that if you have a postdoc, you should encourage them always to give access to someone else who's a longer-term member of the...
Yeah, just to a few other people. So like other people in the lab, that are across many different projects, something like that. Just have people that are kind of in charge of certain resources and have a small pool of them so that you can ensure there's at least a few people that have access. That's kind of the best practice right now. Internally in the BroadE, we are able to get back access for people. It gets a little bit more complicated to deal with that.
So now asking from the postdoc's perspective, would they be wiser to create a separate longer-term Gmail account and use that so that at the point where they leave, the transition would be more facile?
I'm not necessarily sure. I mean, that really also comes down to a policy question because some people wouldn't want somebody's personal account accessing government-controlled data, for example. We'd prefer, maybe like they use their BroadE account or they use their account from Dana-Farber or another kind of institute. So a lot of it is really around policies of the institute more than, like we have ability in the software to do a lot of things, but a lot of it really comes down to sort of what's your own policy about how people, should, like what occurs when somebody leaves. And if they say it's fine that they can use their personal email address, that's fine in our system too. We don't really have an opinion about it. It's just mostly that you want to have sort of a contingency if somebody leaves so that you don't lose access to things. Let's just go on to a few other questions. You had a question before too.
So those access rights you described, you said for the entire workspace, right?
For the entire workspace, correct, yes.
Is it possible, for example, if you have a data folder in there that's the raw data, you don't want anybody accidentally deleting it or modifying it to like give read access for the specific folder to everybody, but let everybody else kind of read write?
Yeah, so the way that it actually works within our platform is that when you share a workspace, it will actually share the Google bucket where you might have folders with the same permissions as the workspace. So essentially we try to make the bucket look as though everybody who has access to the workspace has access to everything in the bucket. Google, though, is actually object level permissions. So each individual object within there, you can set different permissions. So technically what you can do is you can take, like a quote unquote directory, because there aren't really folders in Google, but you can create, say everything within there is read only. And you're still able to do that. It's just that if you were to there's ways that you can do it where it'll still match what happens if you share with people, but you can end up getting permissions that can get out of sync and stuff like that, but it's definitely doable. Generally speaking, we recommend one permission level should go to one workspace and another level to another workspace. So if you have read-only kind of resources that you'd like to share, you'd put those into a workspace that you share read-only and then other ones in another workspace. But you can do what you're talking about. It's definitely possible. Yes?
So if we have a large project that we want to make an open data project so that collaborators who are on the team outside of the BroadE as well as any scientists around the world can access and analyze those data on Terra, is that feasible?
Yes, so I mean, the only requirement that we have within Terra is you have to register. So you have to come in with your Google email address. So the BroadE, for example, we use Google for our identities. It makes it very easy. Other institutes don't, and they have to create other Google identities. But essentially, once they register, they're available to put into groups, to share workspaces with, to add them to projects. You can, if you have collaborators you'd like to bring in, you're able to put them on whatever resources that you'd like. There's also, if you share a workspace and you enter their email address and they're not registered, you'll actually notice it says pending below. It sends an email to those people saying, oh, that's such and such person has shared this workspace with you. When they actually click on it, it'll prompt them to register. So you can use that as well to kind of bring people into the system that are new. Yes?
If you have similar analyses you're running, but with different pots of data and therefore different cost objects, can you switch between things easily, or do you need to then clone workspaces?
Yeah, so billing works at the project level. So on an individual workspace, you can't change billing. So like let's say in one project you had one workspace that was tied to one grant and one that was tied to another. You can't actually change the billing there. You have to do it at the project level. So it has been an issue for some people, especially when some analysis was part of one grant, and then later on it became, oh, this one's actually part of this grant, this part of this grant, and people have had to migrate things. One of the changes we've talked about making is simplifying this so that you're not thinking quite as much about projects and workspaces and stuff like that. It would probably just be more kind of workspaces that have billing. And then that way you don't really have that problem as much. You're able to transition over, this workspace should be charged here and this workspace should be charged here. If we make a change like that, it would be much easier, but generally speaking, you have to do what you said, like clone the data, move the data to other places to change the billing. And it's a limitation of Google. Google, unfortunately, you can't move like a bucket from one project to another. That would allow us to do so much if we could, but we work with what we have.
Along those lines, what do you actually mean by project?
Okay, so project is a Google project. Within our platform, we also have the Terra billing projects. Terra billing project is basically, Terra platform itself creates a Google project, knows about it within our system, but most of the things that it's utilizing are just standard Google project features. So if you'd like to create a virtual machine where you run a Jupyter notebook, we do that. That's done within a Google project, and Terra orchestrates that for you. When you run a workflow, it spins up many different types of virtual machines of different sizes to run your workflow across all of them, and it does that within a Google project. And Google has all of those resources are within a project, and a project has permissions, so you can let people come in, and all of those resources are billed to one billing account. So anything you do in that project bills back to that billing account.
So it's like project workspace notebook.
Yes, 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 exactly, exactly. The workspace concept is it's not a Google concept, it's just a Terra concept. It's a thing we do virtually behind the scenes.
Okay. So a person can have multiple projects.
People can be on multiple projects, they can have multiple billing accounts, multiple workspaces. Yep, there's a lot of different, and a lot of people do make use of multiple projects for different grants, et cetera. I think it's probably at time we should wrap things up, I'd say. I'm happy to follow up, though, with additional questions about what happens when people leave and things like that, because it's come up many times. Oh, sure.
So in line with that, so as a postdoc, if I create a workspace, I become the owner of the workspace.
Correct.
But if I use my PI's billing account, my PI should still be able to see my workspaces, right? Because it's under.
Yes. So one of the things that wasn't mentioned in here that we probably should add is there's another role called project owner. So anybody who owns a project can see any workspace within the project. The reason we put this in is the exact case you're talking about. PI should be able to say, this is my grant that we're working on. I will let my postdocs create workspaces, but I should be able to see what's going on and cost control and all this kind of stuff. And so they become owner and they can see all of it.